Hello from Sweden. Happy to be here, even though I would have preferred to be there physically and not in this video form. I hope that you're all having a great conference, and I will now shortly present to you excerpts from my work called Scale Exercises, Listening to the Sonic Diversity in 5,000 Hours of Swedish Radio with Computers and Ears. And this is a part and a spin-off of my PhD project that I'm conducting at Umeå University in the northern part of Sweden, where I'm connected to a larger research group called WESTAC, or the Welfare State Analytics, which is a project that has the aim of returning to questions of the Swedish welfare state with new methods for large text data analysis. And my wager in my PhD is that we can do the same with audio data as well. This makes it both a methodological and an historical inquiry. And it takes a departure in digitally stored sound. This is why I have these images up here. They're all in one way or another connected to the history of Swedish mass media archivation. And the sound archive is in the center of this thesis that I'm working on. And sound archives in Sweden is a rather unique history. Sweden was exceptionally, and some argue, first in the world with complete radio archivation. Already in the late 70s, we began with complete documentation of radio broadcasting. This entails today a large and complex archive, on the one hand almost impenetrable due to size and metadata lack, on the other hand offering potential insight into the totality of the broadcasting day in the past. This image might demonstrate better what I'm talking of. This is the total amount of documents in the media archive from the epoch of usually referred to as the welfare state, roughly around 1945 and 1989. The total amount here, I would argue, is staggering. This number, which is only in terms of radio documents, 72,000, is not hours, but it's document, where each document can be between 4 to 12 hours long. So I would argue that this is a gigantic archive, and in order to approach such a data source, it becomes interesting to employ methods and explore methods of scaling. And that's why I've chosen to propose sonic analysis, which is a study based on the very sounds and signals of the historical broadcasting. This is a little bit of what I'll try to present to you today. But my work builds on what I argue is a forgotten forerunner of the proper sonic analysis. It's the media scholar Karin Åberg, who was working at the mass media department at Stockholm University in the 90s. And her ambition was a way to to study radio, not as a discursive medium, but as she called it, sound in time. This implied a very specific type of form analysis, but she wanted to look at sound exclusively. It had been discussed previously in Germany, but it was at that time a very new field. And she wanted to study these sounds and look how they changed. I think that the full significance of this idea and Karin's contributions are still unexplored. And I think the reason for this is partly due to that her visionary ideas were very hard to realize at the time. The quote here is from her methodological summary in 1955, where she draws the following quite depressing conclusion. Sonic analysis, the way she tried to make it, was just too difficult to pursue. And I think there might be a shot today to return to these questions and approach the matter of scale sound. But what does it mean to scale sound? The possibility, I would say, appears in the intersection between signal processing and the ears. Where I countered, I would argue, is the problem that sound, as Michel Chion puts it, demands to analyze 100 hours of sound more or less requires 100 hours of work. This, however, is a problem that is not quite true anymore, especially under the conditions of digital audio. Instead, the capacity to analyze expands equal to computational power. Algorithms alone, however, cannot understand the sonic past. but in combination with ears and eyes, importantly as well, they grant access to new knowledge. They grant access to the capacity to scale. I will shortly demonstrate this by some examples applied to Swedish broadcasting from the 80s. The operation in question in these studies that I present to you today is the question of sonic diversity. It's partially because it was a question that preoccupied Karin Ohlberg herself at her time. It was also important, not so much in the 80s as it was in the 90s, looking back at the 80s. How can we create and how did we manage to or not to create a diverse radio type? And this highlights the other unique factor with the Swedish source material. And it has to do with the fact that it's not only involves a very early full documentation of radio, but also a very late deregulation. The Swedish monopoly of radio lasts well into the 80s, where you start to explore different ways of creating diversity and more channels within the monopoly, and then it in the 90s becomes commercialized. So what this allows is full documentation and actually exploration of what happens to the sound of radio at the very point where you start to really explore creating diversity. And that's what we'll do here. See what we can trace in the actual audio data. So this is some first results on a very, very large and abstract scale. What we have here is just all the data from each year sampled, put in and measured against two sonic indices. On the left side, we have acoustic diversity index, which is a way of measuring that comes from bioacoustics. And we can think of it as a way of measuring the different species of sound. This algorithm goes through and clusters similar sounds. So if you would look or study a forest, trying to find out how many bird species are in there. The measurement to the right is complexity, which measures how much the general difference between the frequencies are in every second. And we can see, on the one hand, complexity doesn't really seem to do anything, but on both channels, both the most popular channels in Sweden at the time, P1 and P3, we have an increase more or less steadily in diversity. So we have to bear in mind that these results are experimental, but I think they show an interesting tendency worth dwelling deeper upon. And in order to understand them better, we can go another scale step closer. This is, I would argue, another step where we can start determining different characters or different objects in sound, or different categories. I've here chosen to use classic radio semiotic differentiation between music, noise, and speech. And what we can see here is, though we don't have time to go into it today, some interesting media historical observations about the distribution between music and speech in Swedish radio, though for the point of this talk, we don't find a solution to the question of diversity. One could, looking at the P1 data, come to the conclusion that diversity increases with the increase of speech and decline of music. However, we saw that it was also increasing on P3, and we don't see any increase or decrease clearly in any of these categories. So we have to leave this level behind and go even closer, I would argue, into the data. We can thus focus on the noise, the tiniest of these categories, the one in the middle that almost looks insignificant. But in here, we might find an answer. And what we see is that P1 that excelled more or less lower diversity levels all the way through also has a denser cluster here. And what is clustered here is every second of noise in the sample data. And what the cluster works is a PCA, so it clusters in relationship to each other in similarity. And there we might start be able to trace the different diversity levels, while P3 has a wider cluster. This means that this diversity that we traced is actually perhaps the result of very tiny amounts of sound. Because remember, the noise category is actually a very small part of the overall sound of the radio. However, furthermore, these are color-coded, and this is done by my ears listening to it. And that's my own interpretation of what these different noises are. And I would argue that, without having time to go into it now, there are actually fewer categories of sound in the P2 noise. So that's another way of disturbing this diversity concept. But I think it needs to be questioned or looked at from at another angle. And that is the fact that we have up until now almost left out an entire domain of sound, because we have looked at frequencies. But looking at time and rhythm, we get yet another sound. Here I've mapped the rhythm between speech and music, because being the two main components of the broadcasting, I would argue they are a decent measurement of rhythm. So what I've done here is that I plotted a lot of sample dates, and regarding how similar the rhythm between speech and music is, they cluster more close together. And what you see, once again, is that the opaque nodes here, which are the later ones, come closer together. There we have an indication, even though this data is only small and we have to apply larger analysis to get true answers here, but we have an indication that actually over time, even though the frequency spectrum becomes more diverse, rhythmically, P1 at least here becomes more predictable. That is less diverse. Applying the same method to P3, we get actually quite similar answers, though the beginning and the end of the decade is not so clearly distinguished. So what does this mean? It means, on the one hand, that we could postulate from the small indications of this sample set that as we apply competition to the radio, we have a increasing frequency diversity, more frequencies in play, but we have a rhythmic content loss of diversity, or lower levels of what they call diversity in this case, which means we have these two trajectories that juxtapose each other. But I think there's something more important to take away from this, and that is the complexity of the question. The many different interpretations that we can talk of when we talk of sonic diversity, and the very difficult work of jumping between these scale levels. And that's why I propose that heading forward into the study of sound within humanities and media history, we need to do scale exercises. I